It's said the crucifixion started with the Romans, but that's not really true. It started further back, probably with Alexander the Great, and perhaps even earlier than that. The Romans, however, perfected it, and they were able to crucify many Jews at the time of Christ and before. In my title slide, I'm showing you 4 common versions of crucifixes, starting with, of course, the simple pole that could have easily been nothing more than a tree. Now, victims were usually prisoners of war or slaves or convicts. And it was easy, particularly on a battlefield, to simply find trees and string up victims. The second crucifix you see is the conventional one, which most people feel that Christ was crucified on. The man on the shroud, however, was crucified on the third crucifix you see. Okay, and the final X one is commonly called the crucifix of the Apostle Andrew, who was crucified on an X. Now, victims were usually required to carry the crossbeam or the cross to the site. In the case of the man on the shroud, the first picture shows how he may have carried the crossbeam. Abrasions on the shoulders of the man on the shroud definitely point to the fact that he carried a beam across his shoulders, in which case it would have been tied to his forearms to keep it from falling. Then the second scene, you see another version of it where it might have been carried on one shoulder. And of course, again, the standard way we depict Christ carrying the entire cross, very unlikely because of the total weight and the condition that Christ was in at the time of his crucifixion. Another view of how the man in the shroud may have been carrying his crossbeam. We're looking at something that's about 6 feet long, might weigh 75, 80 pounds, and again, tied to his forearms so that he could carry it without falling. Once at the execution site, assuming it was, again, a standard execution site, since executions were going on a regular basis, it's highly likely that the vertical part of the cross was already in the ground, in which case the man would be lying on the ground with his hands or wrists either tied or nailed to the crossbeam, and then he would be lifted up and placed on top of the vertical member. This is an artist's concept of how Christ may have been crucified. Bear in mind that it was absolutely the most inhumane form of execution that was ever devised by man. Victims were naked, not like you see in this picture, which added to the humiliation of being hung up. The other thing you might notice in this particular slide is that it isn't a very high cross. If you stop and consider the thousands of victims that were crucified daily by the Romans, they probably would not have wanted to go through the aggravation of using ladders and ropes to get victims up on a very high cross. You see in the background of this picture a centurion. He was in charge of the execution team, which consisted of 4 men, and that's what they did. In this particular scene, you see Christ already being tied at or nailed at his wrists and now being lifted up to be placed on the vertical. In this particular view, we see what the feet of an executed man who had been nailed might have occurred. On the left scene, you see actually an image that's identical to the one on the shroud. The shroud only shows 1 foot. We have to assume that the other foot was placed over it and perhaps nailed with 1 nail. There are indications from Some people, the 2 nails may have been used in the feet, but regardless, our feeling is that it's 1 nail. On the right-hand scene, right there, you'll see where the nail might have been placed, directly between the inner portion of the foot. Now, this is another controversial thing. Most crucifixes have always shown Christ with a nail through his hand. In reality, Dr. Barbet, the French surgeon, through studies with cadavers, proved years ago that a nail through the hand would not suffice because the weight of the body would tear the flesh. The man in the shroud's wound occurs at the wrist. And the question, of course, that people ask is, how could the wound be in the wrist if it's commonly called a hand? The best explanation we can give, that in early translations, Bible were done in Greek, and the word for hand in Greek includes the wrist. In any event, the nail went through the wrist. Dr. Zugaby, whom I had the pleasure of meeting at one of the world conventions a few years ago, is a pathologist, been studying the shroud for a good number of years. His theory, of course, is that the exit wound could very well be at the wrist, but he feels the entrance wound is in the hollow of the hand, right up at the rear of the hand where it meets the wrist. The next time you get a splinter in your finger, I want you to remember what a crucifixion nail looked like. That's an actual Roman crucifixion nail. Now we're looking at the hands, and of course this is like you saw in that watercolor painting earlier with the right hand over the left, because again it's the shroud negative. You'll notice 2 flow marks from the wrist wound, and that's based on the fact that a man in agony on a cross probably would shift his weight back and forth about his feet. Another interesting feature, Dr. Jackson, the head of the 1978 team that did the testing in Turin, kind of was puzzled by the long fingers until he came to the conclusion that the image is really a partial X-ray, and what you're seeing is perhaps some of the fingers going up into the flesh of the hands. Again, the negative. Okay, moving on. This, of course, is the chest wound next to a patch, quite an extensive chest wound, about 3.5 inches long by 1 inch wide. Matches perfectly the tip of a Roman lancia. What you do not see in this picture, because you need enhanced photograph to show it, there's a clear halo around the wound. Clear halo from serum. Serum separates from the blood when a person is dead. So this is the only wound on the man in the shroud that has this feature, which is a clear indication that it's a post-mortem wound. Now take a look at you can probably make out some of the brutal punishment that this man took. The man in the shroud has swelling here, swelling over his eye, a dislocated cartilage, a broken cartilage of his nose, and a cut on the lower lip, some of which is evident. There's also coins over the eyes, which we'll talk about a little later. These again is a fold mark, and that's a water stain. Okay, we're going to talk about scourging, something that the man in the shroud suffered severely from. This sort of depicts how a man would have been scourged, being tied to a pillar. The man in the shroud, however, was whipped by 2 men. It's quite evident from the direction of the blows on his backside all the way down past the buttocks and all the way down his legs. You can see the angles. The angle being different from one side to the other kind of indicates that the men were of different heights. This is a Roman flagrum, which is responsible for the damage on the man's scourging. Roman flagrum was wooden handle, leather thongs, either 2 or 3 leather thongs, at the end of which they put lead dumbbells or sheep bone. This is an enhanced photograph which actually shows the shroud in its natural form, but darkens the blood to emphasize the effect of the wounds. Now, in this scene here, this is the dorsal view with his head here and his body going up toward the top. And you can see the beginning of his head here, and we're going to see it on a subsequent slide. I want you to pay close attention to the number of scourge marks that literally covered the entire back of the man. We're looking at over 120 whip marks all the way down his back. And of course, the whip marks also travel to the front. You can see quite clearly here the effects of the whip marks on his chest, and these being the arms, and look at the legs have whip marks all the way down. The man on the shroud took the kind of a beating that's inhumane.